Today's program I'm calling Booze, Brews, and Views, Redlands' Uneasy Relationship with Spiritous Beverage. And as you'll see, for about the first 50 years of our town's existence, the biggest and most divisive issue in the town was that about how to deal with alcohol. And it's really not even a question of totally open and totally dry, or totally wet and totally dry, but just how dry should they be? And it was unbelievably divisive. Let's start with a little bit of context for what was going on in our region, in the East San Bernardino Valley. By the 1870s, Ben Barton, who purchased part of the Rancho San Bernardino in 1857, had that whole area on what is now the west part of Redlands. And in the early 1870s, he laid out all kinds of grape vineyards. And supposedly, in 1873, he was able to produce 30,000 gallons of wine. It's kind of a lot of wine, right? The Vacher brothers managed Barton's winery before building their own winery near Fern Avenue and Santa Mateo Canyon Road. And if you go out Fern Avenue, once you pass the hospital at Teresina and it winds down into Santa Mateo Canyon, that was known as winery grade. And this is why. Into the 1950s, some of those buildings even still existed on the winery site. Dr. J.D.B. Stillman bought his ranch in our area in 1879 and set out 120,000 vines. By 1886, he auctioned off 18,000 gallons of wine at an average of about 12.5 cents per gallon. So he had quite a good return on his wine business that year. And if you're curious about what the location of this winery building was, if you're familiar with the University of Redlands campus, it's pretty much the location of Larson Hall today, and J.D.B. Stillman's house, which you can see in the top, is where the administration building is. A great irony, considering that the Baptists, when they founded their college, were very much temperate. Well, now let's take a look at the national context of what was going on in the late part of the 19th century. At its founding in 1874, the stated purpose of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was to create a sober and pure world by abstinence, purity, and evangelical Christianity. The constitution of the WCTU called for the entire prohibition of the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors as a beverage. While its central focus was on the prohibition of alcohol, the organization also worked on social reforms, like protecting women from exploitation, raising age of consent laws, and Americanizing immigrants like Irish and Germans, who were seen as a major source of the problems with alcohol. The entire prohibitionist movement was from a perspective of a pious Protestantism, and in many ways was anti-immigrant and particularly anti-Catholic. Perhaps the most famous or infamous prohibitionist crusader was Carrie Nation. She was born in Kentucky 15 years before the Civil War into a slaveholding family. After the war, she married a man who was a severe alcoholic, and he died in 1869 from his alcoholism. She later remarried, this time David Nation, a temperate minister. By the early 1890s, the couple lived in Kansas, and she had founded a chapter of the WCTU. She claimed to have had a vision from God that instructed her to work to destroy saloons. She began going to saloons in Kansas, first throwing rocks, then later with a hatchet, which was the suggestion of her soon-to-be ex-husband. Some of the saloons joked that all nations were welcome except Carrie Nation. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in Ohio in 1893 and quickly became a major force in national politics, utilizing strategies that focused on legislation and electing politicians who were first prohibitionists. The Anti-Saloon League eventually overshadowed the other prohibitionist organizations. So that's a quick overview of the national context. A number of the early American pioneers to the East San Bernardino Valley were part of the pious Protestant traditions, which eschewed alcohol and favored temperance, including Myron Crafts, for whom Crafton is named. You may have read in the news recently about the movement to expunge restrictive covenants from property deeds in California. Restrictive covenants were clauses in deeds that restricted who could own them or the purposes for which a property could be used. We're most familiar with the racially restrictive, anti-minority restrictive covenants that were finally deemed unconstitutional in the 1950s. But here's an interesting one from early Redlands. And I'll zoom in, you can see, for this covenant, the said grantee, his heirs or assigns shall not at any time manufacture, sell, or dispose of, or be used as a beverage, any intoxicating liquors of any kind, distilled or fermented, or permit the same to be done in any place of public resort upon said land. This is from 1887. Well, we often look back at the incorporation vote for Redlands in November 1888 as a great achievement for the creation of municipal government. But a major reason that was lauded in favor of incorporation was that the city government would have the power to enact its own laws related to the creation, sale, and use of alcohol. San Bernardino County was pretty wide open on that front, and Redlanders wanted local control of that issue. One person wrote, "Incorporate, in the name of decency and humanity, incorporate, and that soon, if you would save the reputation of Redlands." I'm sure everyone joining us today is familiar with Albert Smiley and his family as the donors of our public library, but you may not know that as Quakers, they were strong temperance supporters. No alcohol was served at Mohonk, the Smiley resort in New York. When Albert Smiley first visited the East San Bernardino Valley in 1887 with his wife Eliza, he attended a temperance meeting. 2 years later, when Albert and Eliza and Alfred and Rachel Smiley selected Redlands for their winter home, they lived at the Hotel Windsor on West State Street, which you can see here, and that's basically State and 4th. Supposedly, they could see men going into and leaving a saloon from their window, and Aunt Eliza, the story goes, soon thereafter took steps to form a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Redlands. So how to deal with demon rum was on the docket at the very beginning. The question was clearly framed as only two options: total prohibition, or what they called high license, where an exorbitant fee would be levied by local government to license the sale of liquor as a deterrent. And here you can see from this article in the February 1889 issue of the Citrograph newspaper that the meeting was held at the YMCA, and the Messieurs Spoor and Smiley, of course, Spoor owned a drugstore, and Mr. Smiley, we all know, both spoke in favor of the anti-saloon movement. So it was early on the brand new Redlands City Council, they called the Board of Trustees at that time, agenda to do something about liquor. On March 17th, 1890, which coincidentally was the Smiley twins' birthday, the new city jail had its first temporary resident, a man charged with drunkenness. 2 days later, a temperance league was formed. Also, ordinance number 20 was passed, and this ordinance was about regulating liquor and how it was going to be licensed early on. So interestingly, a saloon or a bar or a restaurant or a place that would serve any kind of wine or liquor within town was going to be levied a rate of $50 a month, which is about $1,500 a month in 2020 dollars, but you might remember that it would cost a lot less to run your business at that period of time. And so $1,500 was a pretty high fee. Stores and restaurants where they were sold or giving away liquor in small quantities had to pay $10 a month. Drugstores where it was medicinal to have a liquor, they got a fee of $2 a month. And then it goes on for other kinds of fees in the ordinance. But this is really the first major attempt by the city to control the flow of liquor. In the 1892 elections, you could see both sides of the tickets here. The Republican Party at that time saying, "We sympathize with all wise and legitimate efforts to lessen and prevent the evils of intemperance and promote morality." And the Democrats of the day were saying, "We're opposed to all sumptuary laws as an interference with an individual rights of citizens." So it's interesting that there are still echoes of these kinds of sentiments today when one party forwards a notion that it is somehow fighting for a particular definition of morality, and that laws should be created to define that morality. Well, by 1896, it was decided that that earlier ordinance just hadn't gone far enough, and the prohibitionist needle moved further to the side. So this ordinance made the sale of alcohol totally illegal, except for medicinal purposes. So you can say in section 2, the prohibitions of this ordinance shall not apply to the selling or giving away of liquor or liquors for medicinal purposes only by a regularly licensed druggist upon the written prescription of a physician entitled to practice medicine under the laws of the state of California. So here's a drugstore in Redlands, and this would be the only legal place in town that period of time that a respectable Redlander could get a drink. You would bring your prescription from your physician, and it would be filled in a place just like this. So here's a group of men standing outside a drugstore. I'd like to believe that they're all just waiting with their brand new prescriptions to be filled as soon as the store opens. This new ordinance from 1900 takes things even further because it lays out just how police will charge violators of the prohibition ordinances, including establishing that a landowner whose renter is caught is now guilty himself of a misdemeanor, and further restricts the conditions for medicinal alcohol. If you tuned into our webinar a couple weeks ago about the history of the railroad in Redlands, you might remember that the newly electrified Redlands Street Railway in 1900 wanted to extend its line all the way through town to the Teresina area. And that's the green line that you see in the map here in the bottom left corner. And Albert Smiley initially objected to that extension, saying, if carried to our west entrance, that being of Canyon Crest Park or Smiley Heights, the line would reach the city limits, which at that time you can see is the dotted line at the far left side. And that might result in the establishment of a saloon or other nuisance at that point, immediately adjoining our park. So that would have been in the county land. Here's a 1908 map that was created by the Chamber of Commerce. What I love about this map is that it's oriented with south up, which is pretty unusual in map making. At least in today. We're odd because of our topography. So that's how this map is oriented. And you can see in the top right where it says Smiley Heights and San Mateo Canyon, I'll zoom in here, and that little squiggly line next to Teresina is winery grade that goes into the canyon, and there's a little box there with the word winery next to it. So even at least by 1908, there is still a winery at the bottom of winery grade in the canyon. Well, temperance was still going very, very strong in Redlands, so much so that in 1907, the state convention of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was held in Redlands the first week of May in 1907. In 1909, President William Howard Taft visited Redlands, and you can see him here in his car outside of the Casa Loma Hotel. In the cars on Orange Street there at that intersection with Colton Avenue. And a child came up and presented him with a bouquet of flowers, and the note read, "To President Taft, please accept these flowers from the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Redlands, California, in appreciation of your turning down your glass forever." Well, of course, anytime you have ordinances outlining something, there will always be those who transgress. And we have some interesting records from the Redlands Police Department from this period of time. So here's an example from 1913, where the house of Wang Qi in Chinatown was searched. Nothing was found, but they were given a lecture on future conduct. And another house searched in Chinatown for liquor ended up not finding anything, which they referred to at the time as Waterhall. And if you're curious about where Redlands Chinatown was, this map is a little bit misleading because street names have changed. What they call Ligonia there is actually today's Eureka Street. And at that period of time, it was 2nd Street, shortly thereafter. And the little alley, basically, that became the road in front of Chinatown is today's Oriental Avenue. So that's where Chinatown was, and here about 1900, you can see from the map. Here's another example. Jim Riley was charged for drunk and tempting another person at his home with booze. One of the more interesting stories in this early period of Redlands history is the little area known as Silveria Street that was north of the Santa Fe Railroad tracks. Today that's called 3rd Street. It was later renamed, but it was subdivided by a guy named Silveria, and the street is then named for him. But one of its most famous or infamous residents was this woman, Madame Anna Marie Josephine Jure Davies Forbon. She was married several times, as you can see by the litany of last names that she had. But she was originally from Paris, France. She came to the United States through Canada, eventually made her way around the turn of the century to Southern California and ended up in Redlands. And her business seemed to be illegal liquor. She was arrested at least 19 times between 1900 and 1919 for running what was called a blind pig, which was basically a place where you would go to find liquor. I'm just going to share one of the stories because this is the one I find the most amusing, and I think you will too. This is from 1907. It says, Mrs. Anna Forbon, notorious as a blind pig keeper of Redlands, was on trial in the Superior Court today, charged with smuggling beer into the county jail. The offense is alleged to have been committed last summer. The woman had called at the jail to visit the Huntington Sisters of Redlands, who were serving terms for ransacking the home of a Redlands clergyman and holding hijinks with his wine, and carried with her a bottle of beer, which she declares she had supposed was soda water. This is the first instance in the history of the county where such a charge has been prosecuted. An interesting feature of the woman's testimony was that she had a week prior to the alleged offense taken several bottles of the same liquor to the jail, and she and the Huntington girls drank to the dregs. Well, back to the police blotter. Here in 1913, Pablo was arrested for drunk at the corner of Cajon and Olive Avenue, and he had a bottle of whiskey. Shortly thereafter, another, only named as Mexican, was arrested on West Stewart Avenue for being drunk at 1:30 in the morning and having a half pint bottle of whiskey on him, but he was too drunk to give his name. Here we are, Mrs. Skinner reports her husband was drunk and says I can't even read it. How about that? it says he buys his booze in Redlands. Evidently spelling in 1913, or the ability to spell, was not a prerequisite to joining the Redlands Police Department. Here in 1914, an Indian was arrested on Colton Avenue and University, and he had 1.5 quarts of whiskey that he claimed he got in Redlands. Well, things were actually happening statewide too. In the 1914 election, there were some major prohibition measures going forward. And there was actually an amendment to the state constitution on the ballot that November that would have dramatically restricted the number of saloons and prohibited any votes on the liquor question for 8 years. The amendment was defeated, as well as a San Bernardino County prohibition measure. Here in January of 1914, at the Grand Theater on West State Street, was a film called When Women Go on the Warpath. Does that sound familiar? I don't think I'd want to have run into Carrie Nation on her warpath. It's interesting that often people who are seen as famous or important will be attached to causes or movements. And in 1914, the prohibitionist movement tried to latch onto Lincoln. And what's really interesting thing about this is that it's totally apocryphal. So the story that they're trying to say to rationalize or justify voting dry is this story, supposedly from Lincoln. It says, what Lincoln thought of prohibition is shown by a statement which he made to Mr. J.B. Merwin, a personal friend, on the very day of his assassination. He called on Mr. Merwin to give him a confidential message to Horace Greeley, and after delivering the paper, Lincoln said, Merwin, we've cleared up a colossal job. Slavery is abolished. After Reconstruction, the next great question will be the overthrow and suppression of the legalized liquor traffic. And you know my head and my heart, my hand and my purse will go into this contest for victory. In 1842, less than a quarter of a century ago, I predicted that the day would come when there would be neither a slave nor a drunkard in the land. I have lived to see one prediction fulfilled. I hope to live to see the other. Goodbye. How convenient that that was all supposedly taking place on the day of the assassination when no one could ever check the veracity of the story. Locally, J.S. Edwards was running as a candidate for Congress as the Prohibition Party nominee. And the really great irony of J.S. Edwards and today is that the Edwards house was located on today's present-day Plymouth Village, long before it was moved to Orange Tree Lane, where you can find the Edwards Mansion today. And I recently heard that Plymouth Village has put in a bar. So how about that? Harold Bell Wright, the most famous novelist of Redlands history probably, who was also a minister here at the First Christian Church of Redlands. He was there for several years, but he published his great book, The Eyes of the World, shortly after leaving town. Locals saw it as an expose on their lives, with rumors going around about who inspired which character. He starts out describing Redlands, which he renames cryptically Fairlands, like this. In Fairlands, the social rating is largely marked by altitude. The city, lying in the lap of the hills and looking a little down upon the valley, plebeian business, together with those who do the work of Fairlands, occupies the lowest levels in the corporate limits. The heights are held by Fairlands pride. Between these two extremes, the Fairlanders are graded fairly by the levels they occupy. It is most gratifying to observe how generally the citizens of this fortunate community aspire to higher things, and to note that the peculiarly proud spirit of this people is undoubtedly explained by this happy arrangement which enables everyone to look down upon his neighbor. But one of my favorite scenes in the book is later on, where he has a great description of a dinner party at the Taine Mansion, when Mrs. Taine, who is several decades younger than her husband, seeks to control the evening to her particular ends. Wright writes, "But rich foods and rare wines soon loose the tongues that chatter the thoughts of those who do not think. As the glasses were filled and refilled again, the scene took color from the sparkling goblets. Voices were raised to a higher pitch. Shrill or boisterous laughter rang out as jest and story went the rounds. It was Mrs. Taine now, rather than her husband, who dominated the scenes. With cheeks flushed and eyes bright, she set the pace, nor permitted any laggards." Must have been quite a party. Well, what became the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified by 3/4 of the states in January of 1919. The amendment was set to go into effect on January 17th, 1920, a year after the ratification threshold was met. In town, supporters celebrated when the amendment went into effect. So here the headline is, in the facts, "Hold Funeral of John Barleycorn." So John Barleycorn, of course, is related to the liquor. The passing of John Barleycorn was celebrated with appropriate ceremonies at the Presbyterian Church yesterday afternoon under the auspices of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. A song entitled "Three Blind States" was sung by sung by the wives of William Giles and Gates, who were blindfolded and respectively labeled New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the 3 states that chose not to ratify the amendment. Personal liberty was the subject of a reading by Elsie Giles, which was given in a very entertaining manner. She impersonated a Frenchman describing his disillusionment in America, the land of the free, where he had expected to find liberty to carry out his personal desires, even to taking wife number 2. America was sung at the close of this number. Perhaps the most impressive feature of the program was the funeral rites of John Barleycorn. Again, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Connecticut appeared, this time draped in black and carrying a casket labeled John Barleycorn. To the notes of a funeral march, these 3 pallbearers and chief mourners marched slowly to the front of the platform and deposited their burden on the table. Of course, even during national prohibition, there were still those who looked to transgress. And here, Mrs. Alvarez of Stewart Avenue pleaded guilty to possession of beer and was fined $300, $150 being suspended. So interestingly, in the middle of the Great Depression here, or the great depths of the Depression, this woman was fined $300 for beer. And we looked through some of the other arrests from this period of time, and it looks as if there may have been disparity with fines between those who had Spanish surnames and those that had European descended surnames. So it's an interesting thing that deserves more research here in town. Well, one of the most fascinating artifacts that is in the Museum of Redlands collection that one day we'll be able to exhibit soon, I hope, is this bottle of prescription whiskey, complete with the prescription label on it, which is really cool. And if we look closely at that label, it was given by, it was filled by Spoor's Drugstore for, get this, E.M. Cope, a great civic leader, and for whom Cope Middle School is named. And the directions for the prescription are: take 2 tablespoonfuls every 4 hours. Now, clearly, Mr. Cope must have been feeling better, because there is still whiskey in the bottle, and he did not finish his prescription. Well, by the Great Depression, the failure of prohibition was very clear, along with all of its unintended consequences. And the 21st Amendment to the Constitution repealed the 18th Amendment at the end of 1933. But Redlanders were still pretty committed to the cause. And that may be why Taylor's, established in 1934, was just outside the city limit at the time it was built. Post-World War II America was a very different place than it had been before, and national attitudes about spirituous beverage shifted markedly. One heard of house parties where the only beverages served were in two large punch bowls, one filled with Manhattans, the other with martinis, and both with a ladle. A number of cocktail lounges sprouted along Highway 99, today's Redlands Boulevard, like the fabled Phil's, just east of the intersection with Colton Avenue, where all kinds of celebrities stopped on their way to Palm Springs. Pinky's was located on Redlands Boulevard, just west of Orange Street. I like the very classy looking illustration in this early Pinky's matchbook. But clearly later in the mid-century period, they were going straight for the cocktail lounge look, not only with the bottle of wine, but a martini and the smoking cigarette. Hudlo's created its drive-in along with its cocktail lounge known as La Cabana. So La Cabana is the section of Hudlo's that's on the right side, just in front of the Gallon's Super Service sign, if you can look up closely. Here's a matchbook that focuses on that portion of the building. And then maybe the best matchbook ever created. Later on, they had a liquor store as well as the lounge. And when you opened up the book of matches, each match was a different kind of liquor for Hudlo's. So I don't know if Jim Beam paid extra to have its name on there. Everything else is generic. But what a great book of matches. Further down the boulevard, you had Angelo's, which was just east at the corner of 5th Street. And that, in 1964, became the Tartan. You can see one of its early matchbooks there as well. Of course, in 1974, then the Tartan moved across 5th Street to its current location, and this building became a parking lot. Perhaps most notorious of the bars of this period in Redlands history was Father's Also, which you can see on the left side, which is rumored to have had even topless dancers in the 1970s. Here we have a great storm in 1966, causing the patrons, I suppose, of the Flamingo to run outside and grab sandbags. And here we can see a flooded interior of the Flamingo. It was a good opportunity to get one of the few interior bar shots that we have for all of the history of Redlands so far. Of course, Redlands also got liquor stores at the same period of time. And this is Hal's Liquor on West State Street in October of 1968. See, quite the selection. Even great supermarkets like Sage's, which opened in Redlands in 1959, had its share. And you can see the old world foods, which are likely things like Burgundy and Chablis there on the top shelf. Of course, this led to the same kinds of problems that the early prohibitionists had wanted to save Redlands from. Here we have a 1968 party that was broken up by Redlands police on Norwood Street. And by the looks of it, it must have been quite the do. But Redlands' drinking history of this era will also be forever enshrined because of gay 90s. Glenn and Les Charles, who created the long-running popular TV sitcom Cheers, attended University of Redlands in the 1960s and early 1970s. And while a student, one of them actually worked at Gay 90s, which may have provided inspiration for the show. Redlands has come a long way from those early temperance impulses of the 1880s to today. Now the town boasts bars, breweries, a distillery, and, gasp, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, cocktails to go and even consumption in the middle of State Street. So thank you very much for joining us today, and cheers.